All right, so we've got another guest, just like we've been doing for the last few episodes, crossing over with some like-minded podcasters and like-minded podcasts who are touching on church abuse and clergy abuse in different circles. We're doing the Reformed in Doug Wilson circles, although it spreads further than that. And we've got somebody who's doing it in another realm. So if you can introduce yourself, introduce your series, and we'll go on from there.
Yeah, my name is Eric Skwarczynski, and I started a podcast called Preacher Boys in January of 2020. Uh, really started out documenting solely abuse within independent fundamental Baptist churches, which is a denomination, although they would deny that, it's a denomination of extremely conservative, King James only Baptist conservative. So it's a it's a relatively small denomination. I think the Huffington Post once said it was like 1% of the U.S. population, but 1% of that population is still pretty sizable.
It's
And
very
within
sizable.
that
Yeah.
percentage, there are a ton of people who have been abused and a lot of leadership that has abused and been covered up for. And so I started reporting on that through the show, interviewing survivors, similarly to what you're doing with your show in the Doug Wilson kind of circle. And yeah, over the years, I've just come across more and more stories and have noticed that, there's people in the Southern Baptist Convention that have had similar experiences. There's people in other evangelical sects that have had similar experiences. And so now my horizon has really broadened to cover just abuse in religious fundamentalist environments and what contributes to that being able to happen and, contributes to people being able to get away with it. And so I've been doing that show since 2020. Was also in a documentary series called Let Us Pray, A Ministry of Scandals on HBO Max, and just trying to get the word out as much as I can.
Yeah. And you corrected me before we recorded, so thank you for correcting me before we recorded.
Well, now
That
they know. It could have been a
yeah.
secret, but
Yeah. Yeah, we were introduced by Sarah Stainkorb, who sort of first broke the news, at least publicly, on a wider platform about Doug and
yeah.
about some of the abuse that was happening in churches. The CREC, yours is the IFB, ours is the CREC, so the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, and yours is Independent Fundamentalist Baptist. Is that right?
Yeah, independent fundamental Baptists. Yep.
Okay, gotcha. And they're like kind of one and the same, both denominations. Um, so this is a few months. So you started this in January 2020. Um, why why Preacher Boys? Why independent fundamental Baptist? Why discuss church abuse? And thank you for saying your last name because I was going to get that wrong.
No
I was
worries.
going to say Schwarensky. Is like that's not how you pronounce it.
Yeah,
Um,
no worries.
but
Um,
yeah, what got you into this is not something that most dudes do is talk about church abuse.
right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the long story short, when I was a staff kid. I was born and raised in this independent fundamental Baptist movement. And around the time I was getting out of 10th grade, getting ready to go into 11th grade, a man relocated to our church who um, had abused a teenage girl at his prior church. The only way that I found out about this is because I happened to Google his name when he showed up and saw that there was a warrant out for his arrest. And long story short, I started getting really concerned about that, going to the leadership, going to parents, going to youth pastor, and fast forward to about 2, 3 years ago, almost a decade later, he was still volunteering at the church and still there, and I was not. So, gives you kind of a picture of what happened there. And I go
Yep.
into detail a couple times on my show. Um, the reason I started the show specifically was not that specific instance, though that certainly colored my view of the faith I'd grown up in and, the independent fundamental Baptist world at large. What really prompted me to start the show is back in 2019, there was a story that just looked extremely similar to the one I had encountered as a teenager. And the only difference was with this story is that at that time there were pastors tweeting, raising support and for the legal fund for the man who had abused a girl in his church. And so they were sending out on church letterhead, they were tweeting, they were saying, hey, he's being falsely attacked, all these sorts of things. And it really frustrated me. And so I sat in my car in front of my apartment, recorded a quick live video saying, if you're associated with this ministry, this ministry, this ministry, this ministry, you need to leave your church right now. And kind of this explosive, just angry, like, this sucks. It's been happening for years. I'm fed up with it. And I have to say something about it. I've been waiting for somebody to cover this in some kind of way, but I guess that's not going to happen. So let's talk about it. And then I announced working on a project and had like 20 people reach out and thought probably a podcast is going to be the best way to cover this. And so I just started doing interviews consistently and haven't stopped having people reach out to me. So I'm still doing it. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the like 10,000 foot view of a pretty fast paced process, tied into a lot of personal interaction with this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. What I didn't have this any written down, but people have asked us what is the CREC, and so maybe I'll ask you like what is the IFB? If people have never heard, I mean, people might have heard of the SBC. It's like, is it similar to this? What is the IFB? And I know you started there. Now you're more general with abuse and religious context and some of these and
Yeah.
why this happened. So what even is it?
Yeah, the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement is a for reference point for someone who's never encountered it, but they're familiar with a larger denomination like the Southern Baptist Convention. It's very similar in many ways. Women are not allowed to be ordained. The restrictions on women in general is pretty strong, heavily complementarian. Um, you know, but they go a step further than those denominations in many different areas. So instead of being, biblical literalists, they are biblical literalists who believe that only the 1611 King James Version is the inspired and preserved Word of God. They are, literal seven-day creationists, which is fairly common. They're, you know, Kirk Cameron Christians, so they've got the pre-trib,
Mhm.
left behind kind of theology. But then beyond that, I would say the hallmark of IFB churches is an overwhelming amount of control over every area. When it comes to the music you listen to, anything that has a breathy or rock type sound is not permitted. Even the Gaithers were frowned upon by many in our denomination, which is a obviously very conservative music group. We weren't allowed to go to movie theaters, weren't allowed to dance, weren't allowed to drink. There was many different layers of that. And I think beyond that, I think there was a real push for people to dedicate their entire lives to the cause of that denomination. It was not rare to hear pastors give the illustration that, you know, I haven't shared that. I don't think I've ever shared this on the podcast before, but there was a sermon illustration I heard a ton growing up where they would say, have you ever passed a vending machine and you want to get a drink and it's sold out? It has nothing to give anybody. And they would say, as a Christian, as a Baptist, you need to have a sign around your neck that says, I am sold out. Like I have nothing left to give to the world, nothing left to give to anybody else except for the cause. And that was really defining, I think, of my experience was that, no matter how committed you were, no matter how many ministries you served in, it was always give us more, give us more, give us more, and push this bus forward. And that was really the drive and the mentality was like, I'm going to give everything to this organization. It was a really, really controlling, really restrictive environment. And I'm going to say one more thing on that. I was listening again to your interview with Tia Levings
Yep.
that dropped
Yeah.
recently,
You just had
and
her on too recently as well.
yeah, yeah, and I have her coming back on in a couple weeks. So
Okay. Yep.
love the stuff she shares. And one of the things that she mentioned in the interview was that they spent a lot of time splitting hairs over theology,
Yep.
splitting hairs over whether they were doing things correctly. And she said that it was easy to confuse that with critical thinking.
Yes. Yep.
And I think that feeling of splitting hairs over every aspect of your life and thinking that that means you're being critical and you're thinking that means you know what you believe really represents such a swath of my existence where it was like I'm constantly stressed about going to hell. I'm constantly in tears at the altar. I'm constantly doing more ministries, constantly serving in more ways. And I thought that meant that I was choosing to do those things. but instead it was all fueled by pressure, fear, anxiety that was being placed on me by a very specific, mandate from the people that were higher on the ladder than I was.
Yeah, that's why I was so intrigued by Preacher Boys, and we have been tagged on so many stinking posts as like,
I
oh, you got
know.
to listen to Preacher Boys, you got to listen to Sons of Patriarchy,
I
and a
made
lot
an
of it has to
exodus
do
from
with
X, and
yeah,
I
X and
went back in the
Facebook.
other day and
Yeah,
saw, oh, tag, 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 tag. I was like,
yeah,
I don't want to be on X, but I guess we're both popular in
yeah.
tags
So
and posts there.
yeah, but a lot of it revolves around like it's the way you describe IFB circles is how I've heard described. I've never been part of a CREC church. I've been in the OPC and the PC and Reformed denominations, if people know what those
Yeah,
are. Um, but it tends to revolve around the same thing. It's like your life does revolve around this, that you're constantly doing more, and not just constantly doing more, being told you need to be doing more. And
yeah.
at
The
least in the
moving
CREC,
goalpost. Yeah,
yeah, move the goalposts. But there's a nefariousness or a there's more all-encompassing stuff to do, at least in the circles that we're exposing, Doug Wilson circles, where he's created a media empire, which I'm not aware of. Maybe you're far more aware of IFB circles than I am, but he's created a media empire, he's created a publishing house, he's created a classical school curriculum. So you don't have to get out of these circles, but you're also
yep,
told to stay in these circles. This is safe. This is God honoring. You need to classically educate your kids. You need to have as many kids as possible. The woman has to do so many things. The man has to do different, but so many things.
yeah.
Um,
It's
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 all
so similar.
consuming.
Yeah, and it's funny because like this is why I have had more conversations that go a little bit broader. Is that and using Tia Levings as an example again, like she
Mhm.
went from IFB
Yep.
adjacent circles. Well, she went from like evangelical to IFB
Yeah.
to kind of
SBC.
SBC
Yep.
to Reformed, and there's minute differences
Yeah. There is.
between those
There'd be
experiences.
like
And
theological differences between them.
yeah, and even those, when you really get into the practical theology, very similar.
Yeah.
Like the structure of it, the way that women are treated, like all that
Yep.
stuff is very similar. But yeah, theology was such a staunch thing. Like most people in my denomination would have looked at a Calvinist and said, like, you might be a Christian. I mean, we would have looked at. I mean, some
Yeah.
Christians look at Doug Wilson's, yeah, but
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 I'm not to say it's like it goes the other way too. All these reform people is like look at independent fundamental Baptists or
yeah,
Armenians or whatever it is like there might be a room for you in heaven, but
right.
there's a waiting list.
And we had the restricted we had the media empires too, like our denomination was very heavily invested in building colleges, and so you had West Coast Baptist College and Golden State Baptist College in California. You had Bob Jones, University, which is probably the most publicly well
Right.
known in
Yep.
Greenville, South Carolina. You had Hiles Anderson College, which was one of the flagship IFB colleges in Hammond, Indiana, which was one of the biggest mega churches in the country for a long time.
Right.
Ran, you know, dozens and dozens of buses into Chicago every single week and brought in kids to the church, largest Sunday school in America. I think it was Christianity Today ran that story back in the 50s or 60s. And so there was all of that. And then on top of that, because it was education group focused, we had the curriculum like Abeka, we had Bob Jones curriculum. And so everybody, although we were independent, which is the biggest misnomer ever, we
Yeah.
all used the same curriculum. We all
True.
went to the same Bible colleges. Our pastors all graduated from the same colleges, were inspired by the same pastors. The only difference is, and it's why reporting on the IFP is incredibly hard for someone who's not been in it, is that we don't have decades of logs of here's who was in leadership at such and such a time.
Right.
We don't have the
There's no
SBC
central
like,
leadership to kind of give you all that stuff.
right, right. Like the people in it know, but we don't have like the SPC where it's like pull up the meeting, the record from this meeting in 1974. It's like, there's varied versions of IFB history that depend on who you think was the leading pastor in such and such a decade. It's really messy. But it leads to some interesting conversation at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious too. For So you did the live video talking about the ministries, if you're part of this ministry and that ministry and this ministry, then you started hearing from people. When did you realize oh, the abuse here is even worse than I thought on the front end? And you're like, I've got more to go through on this series, or more stories than I ever thought was possible. Because we have that for Sons of Patriarchy, and I'm curious for Preacher Boys, and we're like, there's more than anybody knows in these circles.
It's a weird question to answer because I won't mention Tia Lovings again after this. But I was literally just talking to her
Yeah, it's just the closest to mind. Yep.
yeah, and she just says things better than me, so it's easier to sometimes, just refer to some of the
He's
things that we talked
extraordinarily
about.
well spoken. Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the things I think we had talked about in a prior interview was I said something like evangelicals are now saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
And she kind of took me to task for it in a very loving Tia way, but was like, they've been saying that, and I kind of corrected myself and said, well, they're saying it now in the public sphere,
Yeah.
like some of the talking points. And I guess that's like when it comes to the thing of like discussion around shock or, are you surprised? I don't know what word to describe when a news story breaks, but it's not shock. Like
No,
I rarely hear stories now.
at least not anymore. Yeah. Same for me.
Yeah, and honestly, like because I had sat with this like internal thought and like I studied the IFB for a long time before actually starting a podcast, most of those bubbles had already burst. And I think because I was at such a formative age when I first came across a story of abuse, it painted like my church was my world. It was the religion, like, and so when that burst, that was the pain of feeling like, oh, this is all really bad because I saw the reaction of the people responding to it. And then you immediately start looking into your movement and seeing what had been reported thus far. And again, by the time I got to the show, it's like, I already know this is really bad. And now it just feels like this is affirming like, oh, I wasn't wrong. Like this is as bad as I thought. Now it's not to say like there are certain details of stories that have shocked me or horrified me in
Yeah.
ways that like I couldn't have anticipated. I couldn't anticipate the mental toll of the volume of stories, but I don't know. Like it's such a weird like I was shocked how many people were willing to share their story more than I was
Same here.
shocked at the amount of stories that existed. Like I guess that's kind of like the differentiator there. I gotta ask you a question though,
Go
because
for it.
I'm curious, and I know we talked a little bit after Sarah introduced us. Um, actually talked a lot because I talk a lot.
That's
But
okay. I needed
uh,
it.
what was your draw to covering the CREC as an outsider to it? Because for me, the IFB roots are always going to be in the show.
Yeah.
Like I saw this so closely. For you, did you see something similar, or was it something where you were like, I just see this as a big story and nobody's really consistently reporting on it?
Yeah. A lot of it. So it's personal in the sense, not in the sense that I was ever part of a CREC. That's not part of my story. But I was trained as a reformed pastor. I was trained towards the reformed ministry.
Yeah.
I went to Westminster Seminary, California, got my master's degree there, and so I was moving in reform circles towards ordination. And the CREC bills themselves as a reformed denomination, and there's a long history with them and the rest of reformed denominations. Like, hey, you're not really part of us because you're heretical. And yes, there's parts of that that's true, but there's also like, but there's so much overlap in some of these denominations, especially
Yeah.
culturally. There is a lot of overlap, and theologically too. There's a lot of overlap, but it uh it didn't really strike me. I had an internship in Eastern Washington, and I think I've only said this once during the series when I think I was talking to Mike Cosper from
Hmm.
Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I think. Um, but I had an internship in Eastern Washington, and the church was something like 2 hours away from Christchurch, Moscow.
Okay.
And the nature of the church and where we were situated and the people who were part of it, it was kind of unofficially known as like a safe haven from one of the CREC churches, and there was one I think in the same city. And so we had people who had come from that church and were at the church that I was at for the internship. And part of that internship was also was preaching, but it was home visits and getting to know people within the congregation and asking about their lives and just being part of it. Which was one of the best parts of that internship. I really did enjoy it. This is a few years ago. Um, but people, I was asked the question, "Hey, have you heard of the CREC?" And I won't say who the person is because they've asked me to remain anonymous. Um, and I said, "Yeah, I've heard a little bit about them. The only thing I'd heard is like, oh, they're just bad theologically. That's the extent of my knowledge." And they asked me, "Did you like have you heard about other things?" And I was like, "What other things are you talking about?" And they said, "Have you heard about abuse?" And I was like, I mean, to be honest, I've never, I've never like looked into or heard about abuse in any church circles at all. Um, Partially, I was kind of blind to it and not aware of it. Even though it'd been going around me, I'm assuming I was at Mars Hill in not in Seattle, but in Orange County, and so I knew some stuff on the back end on kind of the on the ground level that people outside of Mars Hill didn't know, and that fed a little bit of this too. But I heard this woman's story um, about her abuse, not at the hands of the elders, but how it was handled by the elders. And after that, I looked up abuse at Christ Church. I distinctly remember sitting in the office at the church office and typing in abuse Christ Church Moscow and seeing a few stories that had been made public in 2015, 2017-ish, and then 2020. And then Stankorb's article came out that fall. So this is summer of 2021. Stankorb's article in Vice came out fall of 2021. Um, I was like, I don't know if you curse on Preacher Boys, but um,
Sometimes it's appropriate sometimes.
I was like, holy shit, there's so much abuse that's going on here.
Yeah.
And feel free to I'll edit this or if you want to edit this too. Um, but I saw like this is really bad. And we've been warned about some of this stuff in seminary, which I think I'm still a Christian. I thank God that I was warned about abuse in the church in my
Yeah.
seminary training. And they did the right thing. So you talk to authorities, you talk to anybody that you can the second you hear about any type of abuse
No.
that's happening in these circles. So that was my first um, kind of run-in with this, and it was because I'd actually talked to the person who had been abused. And I never talked to somebody who had been abused and to the extent that she had, and then how it was handled by the elders who's like, hey, you're being abused because you're not having enough sex with your husband, and you are being too opinionated, or you're being too controlling, or you're emasculating him. You need to be more submissive towards your
Right.
husband. And I was like, am I hearing you right? That when you came to the leadership that you were being abused, that they blamed you for your abuse and not the person who was abusing you. Um, and I didn't see her story anywhere. And I was like, if I haven't seen her, if I can't find her story and it's not been made public, I'm not abuse informed. I didn't know any of the statistics, but I was like, if I haven't heard hers, I wonder who else I haven't heard
Right.
in
Yeah.
these circles. And that got me down. I was like, this is really bad. And in the circles that I was looking at, and they were adjacent enough to the circles I was already in, to where I had
Sure.
I had an understanding of like their theological system, of their cultural system, of their views on humanity, on the world, on God, on Scripture, on male-female relations. It was within my circles enough to where I was like, I think there's something here, and I think I can speak to this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you resonate with this, but I'll throw it out there and see,
Yeah.
see if you do. But um, one of the things that's been challenging to me, in examining the faith that I did hold on to,
Hmm.
and was raised in, is there's a lot of times, especially I would say from the time that I left my childhood church and like the next 5 to 6 years, the the faith that I was taking in and the understanding I had of the Bible and of the teachings of Jesus was leading me to drastically different places than where the Doug Wilsons of the world seem to end up. But I also feel like that was kind of it kind of served as a filter from like understanding how sinister some of the writings of some of these leaders were, because I interpreted it with the most positive possible interpretation.
Yeah.
And the perfect example of this is one of the books that I devoured of Doug Wilson's that I recommended a million times. And sorry to anybody I recommended
Yeah. You've read
this
more
book
Doug
to.
Wilson than I have. I'm impressed.
Well, I read his book Heaven Misplaced, which is a very small book,
Okay.
but I thought was a very beautiful book at the time
Mhm.
because the whole book is really this post-millennial theology and this idea of, you know, we're so focused on heaven and like heaven being our home and we're so excited about heaven. But the whole idea of the book is like, how do we bring God's kingdom here?
Yeah.
And when I read that at 20, was it 20 years old, I think I was when I read it, I thought that is incredible. And I associated that with, okay, this is me working with this orphanage, and this
Yep.
is me
Exactly.
serving
Yep.
the fatherless
Yeah.
and the widows, and this is us being able to build hospitals and like,
Yep. You
and I,
impute your ideas of bringing the kingdom of God into the book
yeah,
rather than what Doug
right.
actually
Like
meant.
it was like, man, God's kingdom is going to be this utopia. And the verse that I still think about all the time, but the verse that I loved in scripture was there was this verse where it was saying that, Satan's been defeated. I'm paraphrasing. Satan's been defeated, but now we get to trample his strongholds underfoot. And this concept that and I'll find the verse in a second, but this concept that like, hey, the big bad is destroyed, and now we get to do the fun work of like, hey, the main battle's over. Now we get to stomp out poverty. Now we get to stomp out fatherlessness. Now we get to stomp out all these horrible things that have plagued our world as a result of sin. I would have said at that time. It's like that's beautiful. And not having the IFB mentality I've been raised in, where it's like, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through and I'll fly away. And when the roll is called at yonder, I'll be there. It was like, no, we can bring God's kingdom here. But again, my view of God's kingdom, like you said, looked very differently than, antebellum slavery was one of the most peaceful times in our history. And that's
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
God's kingdom could look like. It's like
Yeah.
that was way different. But I never picked up on those themes that were so sinister because I had a optimism about like, hey, we all agree that, you know, loving each other is probably a good thing, right? Like
Yeah, and that's been fun to help people understand some of Doug's writings and his works because they're sometimes intentionally not obtuse, but they're intentionally vague in some
yeah,
of the application to where it like he kind of allows or invites you to inject your own worldview or whatever it may be into it. And so it seems less sinister when you first bring him in. And then that's how
right.
he gets into your life and seeps in and says, no, that's not what I actually mean. I mean, slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, women should submit to all men everywhere, that men should rule the world, that we have to repeal the 19th Amendment, that we have to make all the nations Christians. So it
Yeah.
kind of comes into you after your initial like, well, he's not that bad. He's just like a kind little grandpa. And then he's like, I gotcha. And then he starts injecting himself into you.
Well, Sarah McCammon, who I don't know if you've interviewed her for your show or if you
No,
plan to.
no, I haven't heard of her. This is
Um,
news to
she
me.
wrote she wrote a book. She wrote a book called The Evangelicals,
Oh yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that.
and she's the NPR political correspondent and the co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, which is a
Okay.
former evangelical. And so she's had a lot to write about, obviously, over the last couple of years.
Sure.
And one of the things a phrase that she used that has stuck with me in our conversation is she said, and she was referencing Trump at the time, but this is perfectly apt for what you're describing with Wilson, is she said, it's implausible deniability. He says something that is so incredibly crazy that the instant defense is he didn't mean that. And you see that when it comes to Doug Wilson saying something about like slavery, where he says in this flowery way, where it's like he didn't mean the things that actually happened during that period.
Mhm.
Or when you hear John Piper say, you know, a woman should endure being smacked, by her abusive husband,
Mhm.
you know, well, he doesn't mean that. But
Yeah,
it's like they're straight up saying these things. And I think because we don't think in a sinister way, at least I would hope the
exactly.
people listening to
People
this
use
don't.
what he or they
Right.
say and say like, well, they said it. They kind of open the door, and I'm just gonna walk right through that door.
Right. He really means the good thing that I'm interpreting it to mean, and not the thing he verbatim said, or
Exactly.
it's like
Yeah.
that's the approach. And so I don't know, it's always interesting like hearing people like their context and approaching the material determines how much of it they take in. And even Mark Driscoll's a great example, like going from the independent Baptist world and the preaching from that environment, like the first thing I would tell people when I started listening to Mark Driscoll is like, he's amazing. I've never heard someone preach like him before. He is so kind and gentle.
Hmm.
That was my take on Mark Driscoll because I came from a far more severe
Oh,
preaching
right, right,
style
right. I
than
was
Driscoll
like,
had.
I was about to
You're
disagree. I was
like,
like, are
wait a
you sure
minute,
about
wait a minute.
that?
Do you know about Mark Driscoll? No.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's which is also we've heard that in the CREC circles where people will
Yeah,
come. We've had people come on the series who've come from IFB circles
yeah.
into the CREC and like it's so open, it's so liberating. I can
I
drink
can go to
alcohol here,
theaters.
I can smoke.
Yeah,
And then they realize like, oh, it's the same thing, just in different cloaks.
yeah,
It's they use different rules, they use different standards, and the same thing is still expected of me. Although there's more like liberative use of whatever it is that my vice may
yeah,
be or whatever it is. It's so interesting that I've heard that more recently.
yeah.
That it's
Same
like, oh, this
toxic
is
environment, just a different
exactly
font,
same toxic
basically.
environment, just yeah, different ways of doing it or different ways of experiencing it. Um, and you said this like 10 or 15 minutes ago, and this struck home for me. So I've never been abused in these circles, and I mean, as far as I know, you've never been abused or sexually abused in these circles. But hearing some of these stories and talking to so many people, that's that does some stuff to you as a human being, as a person who hears these from other people. After having done this for 5 years, and I've been recording for about a year, but the show's only been alive for coming up on 4 months. Um, what does talking to all these people do to you as the one who's interviewing? Because we'll talk rightly so about what it does to those who are abused, but for those of us
Yeah.
who have so many conversations, what like maybe bring people into the mind of what's it like listening to hundreds of these stories and then producing them?
Yeah, I mean it's it's interesting. And no, I never was abused, especially not by clergy. I had one situation where there was a very inappropriate interaction with somebody
Yeah.
that I've shared very briefly on the show. But it's something that, like, again, I personally feel like I have some closure over at this
Yep.
point, and
Sure.
it's been talked about to the people it needs to be. Um, in terms of hearing people's stories, and I say that to say I don't consider myself a survivor. I don't
No.
compare myself to these other stories. And I I look at some of these people, and it's a miracle to me that they're able to walk through the day, with the things that they've experienced. Um, Honestly, the when we talk about like things we expected starting the show, like the biggest mistake I made early on is that I didn't schedule out my time to separate and give myself time to take a second from these conversations.
Yeah.
Um, the way I started the podcast was I set up a Calendly link. I just blocked out a big chunk and said, schedule a time. And I would have three interviews in a row.
Yeah.
And some of those would be 2 hours. And, some would be extremely heavy and even more so than others. And a couple of months into doing the show, I found myself like you're sitting in the car in a parking lot of a store and you start crying, or you're out for a walk and you feel overwhelmed or anxious, or you're sitting inside and you feel suffocated, or you're sitting at the dinner table and it's like, you feel this like very heavy weight. And, and I've had to really learn to manage absorbing those stories, because there are. I mean, and and I know you know this because you've been doing this like recording for the last year, is that what you can say
Hmm.
once you get to the podcast and what can be shared is usually like 30% maybe of everything that the person tells you
Yeah.
or everything that you know is happening or all the context you might have. And so I think the heaviest thing doing the show is like and it's hard to regulate like this feeling of I know how bad it is and I know it's even worse than how bad I know it is,
Yep.
and everybody else around me only thinks it's this bad. And like, how do I communicate the weight
Yeah.
that I'm feeling about this to
And we're
people who
only hearing the tip of
don't
the
know?
spear of some of these stories.
Yeah,
There's so many more out there.
and like that's such a weird. I was telling somebody the other day. I said it's. Have you ever seen the movie Spotlight with us about the Boston Globe
Yes. Yeah.
reporting
Yeah.
on the
I have.
Catholic
I have.
Church?
Yes. Yep.
There's a scene in there. I was kind of laughing. So I came out of the office, my hair was all crazy, and I was telling my wife about all this stuff, and like I was like, I just need a big bulletin board of like all these things happening.
Yep.
And she's like, "You look insane."
Yep.
And I said, "I feel like the scene in Spotlight where Stanley Tucci's sitting on the bench with Mark Ruffalo, and he's like, I'm not crazy, I'm not paranoid, I'm experienced." And I think that I feel that a lot where it's like I have to check myself and be like, am I getting a little tinfoil hat here? Like, am I is this too crazy? Like,
Yeah.
am I too lost in my own sauce here? And then you take a step back, you have one more call with the survivor, and you're like, oh, it's worse than that. It's like it's such a mind warping thing. And I don't think there's any way to do this where it doesn't affect you in a negative way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you can do it in a healthier way, but
Yeah.
you're still smoking the cigarettes. Like it's kind of it's like you can smoke less,
Yeah.
but it's still every story hurts. And
You're
you
just getting
know,
a lot of secondhand smoke, and you can't really help it.
yeah, it's like a secondhand trauma, but also not comparative at all. So then you
No,
feel
shouldn't
guilty for feeling
shouldn't
like that.
happen to
It's
me. Yep.
it's a mess. Like it's because like when I start feeling like, oh, this is so heavy, then it's like, come on, Eric, you didn't even go through it. Like, it's such a weird mental game all the time. And it's why I like talking to people like yourself or people like a Sarah Stancorb who does a lot of interviews, is like it's a uniquely frustrating thing to do. And I don't think people really understand, you know, how much I don't know how heavy it is. And
Yeah.
that's rambly, but like that's how I feel about it. It's like it's such a mismatched group of thoughts of like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really hard, but also I don't want to admit that it's hard because I don't have a right to do that versus the people who've actually experienced. It's a
Yeah. I
weird
feel
thing.
bad when I vent. I'm like, I'm not the one who this happened to. I'm just
Yeah.
the one who hears about when it happens to somebody else.
Yeah.
And when I
You feel
vent, it's
dumb. You're like, I heard somebody's experience and that was really hard for me. But
yeah.
it also it's like it is, like there's a reason trauma therapists go to therapy.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like it's all the same. So
Yep.
anyway.
Another one too, because one, I mean, there's a few differences and there's a ton of similarities between what we do. And one difference is you've left the faith and I'm still in the faith.
Yeah,
I'm
let's fight. Let's
Yeah,
debate right now.
I'm
Just kidding.
I'm more curious about um doing a series on abuse in the church in the IFB circles and religious trauma as a non-believer. For those that you talk to and yourself, like what are some of your thoughts coming into these interviews and talking about faith from somebody who doesn't have the faith?
I mean, the fact that I did helps me have the context where like I can empathize still. The weirdest thing now is like I've just been out of it. I've been out of in like fundamentalist circles for so long,
Yeah.
like almost a decade, where it's like sometimes when I'm like covering a story, I have to like mentally put myself back in my shoes and be like, how would I have analyzed this at that time? And like, what's the perspective that I would have? Um, but like honestly, I think the biggest difference like now coming at it from and I started the show still holding on to some faith and now
Okay.
I
Yep.
don't. So but I think my approach is kind of the same. It's like this is an injustice and it's a violation of people who do believe this,
Yep.
And so I
regardless if you're a
still,
Christian or not, this is still bad.
yeah, like I still believe spiritual abuse is a thing.
Yeah,
You know, and very simply put, regardless of whether or not, someone's faith is like whether or not someone's object of their faith is real, the fact that they have faith in that thing gives puts them in a uniquely vulnerable position if somebody wants to leverage that against them. And so I still think it's incredibly violating for somebody in the clergy to leverage someone's faith against them to harm them. And I hold to that view as someone who doesn't hold to any particular faith at this point. So I don't think it puts me as far outside the sphere as
no,
some people would claim. But I will say the frustrating part is that, you know, now I think it's given a lot of pastors a reason to write off what I'm saying,
yeah,
because you're just attacking the church or
yep.
you're just this.
The same thing we
But
get, even though I'm a Christian. They'll
yeah,
say the same
exactly.
things.
And I was going to say what's frustrating about that is like those same pastors, when I was a Christian, would say, well, you're not really a Christian or you're harming the. So, like, again, same thing, different font. And it's like I've just come to a point now where I'm like, no matter what I do, the point is people don't like the band-aid I'm pulling at.
Yeah,
And so, whether whatever thing that I call myself, like they're still going to have an issue with it, and they're going to find like if I tomorrow said I have converted back to Christianity, I'm going to seminary, I'm becoming a pastor, I'm going to change this from within, the pastors who want to perpetuate abuse would still find some reason, the
yep.
color of the carpet in my church, the type of music I play, to disregard the actual problem at
Yeah,
hand.
well, look
And
at Sons of Patriarchy. It's run by somebody who's seminary trained, was going to be a
right.
pastor, who's still in these circles, and they're like, "Well, it's really not that bad," or "You're just trying to give us a black guy." I was like, "No, you already have a black guy," and I'm trying to show where that is to people
Yeah.
who are
You
looking.
are a preacher boy. We should switch names. I think that would be, we can just do a name swap.
That's that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, last few from me, and feel free
Yeah.
to ask anything on your end too. When it comes to maybe you've already said some of this, some potential misconceptions about what it is that you do.
Hmm.
Um, what what do you hear most often? You're like, that's just not true, based off of what we're talking about, based off what we're exposing. The thing that you hear most consistently, like, hey, that's let me correct the record for what you think is happening or what you think is what I'm trying to do. Here's what I'm
Yeah.
actually doing.
I mean, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but like the biggest accusation that comes my way is that I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel for stories.
Okay.
I'll put out a story and someone will say, "Wow, now we're really digging down to find something,"
Yeah.
or, and again, it's just a catch-all distraction from what I'm talking about. The truth is, again, I'm making difficult decisions on what story can I get out this week
Yep.
of these 10 things that happened. Which one do I cover? What gets to be an Instagram post versus which gets to be an episode, and what survivor can I talk to and what survivor can't, all that sort of thing. Not to mention the people that reach out who I redirect to law enforcement or a lawyer because they're not ready to go on a public platform. They
Yep.
need to go report it or go to law enforcement, which there's been dozens of those. So like that's the biggest frustrating one is like, oh, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for stories. And another silly way that this presents itself, where again it's they're going to criticize either way, is when I was heavily focused on just IFB and I didn't touch anything outside of that ever. Um, it was, why do you focus on the IFB? You just have a vendetta against it.
Yep.
And then I would cover church outside that denomination, and it would be like, why are you just going after the church? Why don't you talk about Hollywood? And then I covered
Yeah.
Harvey Weinstein when that happened and drew parallels to how dangerous abuse is. Well, why are you grouping us in with it was like, come on, like, and then it would go all the way back to, I thought you were focused on the IFB. Guess you ran out of stories and now you're covering this. So it's like whatever you do, people aren't going to be happy. And I think if I can imagine, I think the struggle that you probably face that's similar to me is that
It's a
because,
hundred percent the same thing.
well, and you're dealing with it as, you know, from a religious perspective,
Yeah.
I know that gets called into question,
Yep.
but then also you are interviewing people who are all across that gamut. Like
Yeah,
Sarah
everywhere.
Stancorb
Yep.
is as far as I believe doesn't affiliate with any faith, but
Yeah,
she's an
she's
interested
atheist agnostic. Yep.
observer. Tia Levings is obviously, very critical of fundamentalist groups, and I
We've
think
interviewed
many,
the broad spectrum. That was
yeah,
intentional too.
yeah, like I'm sure you get the feedback of why don't you interview Christian voices in this
Oh my
versus,
gosh.
you know, scraping the bottom of the barrel for guests,
Yeah,
which
we get the
it's a
same thing. We get you're just a leftist
yeah,
progressive is going after the conservative churches. Like, I don't think you realize I'm still in a conservative denomination.
yeah,
I'm still quote unquote bought into some of these things, even though I hold slightly different interpretations on them and that stuff. But and we get the same thing where it's like, well, you must have run out of CREC stories because you're now going after
yeah,
all these other reform denominations. Like, no, it's like there's a reason why we left, not left. There's a reason why we've pivoted,
yeah,
and then we're going back at some points, whether it be for legal reasons, whether it be for still have long conversations that we have to have with people, or when we go to other denominations, like, well, there's only a few of those bad churches, and why are you so focusing on them? You should be focusing on the ones that
yeah,
really have it. Like, why not go after the main line and they're transing kids and they got drag queen story hour and why aren't you going after that stuff? I was like, because that's just not the point of what we're trying of what we're
yeah,
trying to of what we're trying to expose. Or people who are I haven't gotten the you're too Christian yet, which is nice. But I have gotten the you're a tool of Satan, you're a leftist scumbag, you're all that stuff.
yeah,
Even though I'm like, do you like even know some of this like that
yeah,
I still hold to I still hold to some of the core Christian tenets,
right.
which is so interesting. But yeah, it's the same feedback you get on pivoting or focus on this or don't focus on that or you're scraping the barrel is I'm assuming that's pretty broad spectrum for podcasts that go after the stuff that we go after.
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say like the you're too Christian critique, like that is something I'm surprised you haven't gotten the
Nope.
critique just because and it's probably because of the range of guests that
Yep.
you're having on, but I know that's one of the things. This isn't a question, it's just a thing I feel. But
Yeah.
I feel like there is a be careful what I say to not make people think I'm talking about someone I'm not. But I do see people, particularly a lot of pastors or a handful of pastors who have pivoted into like the anti-abuse advocacy space.
Yep.
And it feels kind of just like, to me, it feels uh, like covert evangelistic tool in their tool bag, to be like, let me keep you from, let me stop my church from hemorrhaging, or, let me sell a book, or let me, build a platform on this
Yeah.
because, and it's the same guys that built platforms on a billion other things,
Yeah.
and this is the next trendy one. And with that said, it's hard for me to not feel an immediate
Yep.
question mark in my head about it. Like even when we first talked, like if when you said like right when you said you're like I'm still in it, I was like, okay, what's the angle of this show? But I think it's unfortunate because I think there are a lot of people who are doing really good work
Yeah.
who are still believers who want to clean up their own neck of the woods, but it almost feels like there's a conflict of interest sometimes of like
Yeah.
I want to build up the church, but also I'm like going after like the organization. It's
Yeah.
like I think it can be easy to be like reticent about that.
Yeah. No,
And
that's you. I mean, you're in the same. I'm assuming some of the same circles that I have been graciously invited, very skeptically into.
mm,
Um, but there's a lot of distrust in these communities, rightly
yeah,
so, because they see people like me. I didn't try to get into this. I was sort of asked, but also um, kind of stumbled into it
yeah.
myself. I wasn't like, hey, I'm gonna make
Who
a name
who
for myself and I'm gonna do a
who
big
asked
thing.
again? I'm trying to remember the origin. Like,
Yeah, I was asked to produce this series
Gotcha.
by like a think tank, an online think tank examining Doug Wilson in Moscow. Um,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, they approached me and asked if I'd be interested in doing this just because they had seen some other stuff that I had posted and talked about. And I made it very clear, it's like I have no desire to make a name for myself nor a platform for myself. I actually like when people don't know who I am and know the people that we have on the series, which people have different views and perspectives on that. And I just my thing is I want people to be helped in the church, not hurt in the church. And we have a saying at Sons of Patriarchy is like, don't touch the children. If we can all agree on that,
No,
then
it's
we can work together.
bipartisan.
Yeah,
Like we can
yeah,
do that. Um,
exactly.
what, uh, sorry, and now I've got. I know you're like last few questions. Now
No,
my
that's
all
those
my
are
bells are ringing.
on my end, but yeah, feel free to ask whatever you want.
How do you feel? I know you said you like being in the background, but the
Hmm.
nature of what this is,
Yeah, you are
like,
going into a discussion that
like,
I've had many times.
like the nature of doing a podcast or doing, and again, it's funny, like the criticisms flip sides. Like when I started my show, I would like ask too long a question,
Yep,
and it would be like, shut up, we don't want to hear from you, we're listening for the guest. I would get comments
exactly.
literally like that.
Same here.
And then a couple, like a year or two in, it was like, well, I loved hearing the guest perspective, but what do you think about it? And people build this kind of like relationship to you where it's like, well, now I know Eric. Eric talks about this. Now I know Peter. Peter talks about this. And people want to know more about, what do you think? Like, yeah, we heard what Sarah said, or we heard what Tia said, or we heard what Doug Wilson's professor said, and like, but what's your thought on it? Or where are you at? Or what have you been or where are you mentally with this? How much responsibility do you feel like you have to your audience to be like, hey, here's where Peter's at? Like, if you're having a crisis of faith, do you feel a need to be like, hey, this is what's going on right now? Or do you feel like, I have my private life, I'm just a voice that's assembling this. It is purely production type role. Because, like, those lines have been blurred so much for me where, like,
Yeah,
I've been open about faith in the beginning. So now I better be open if it changes because I don't want to be a hypocrite.
yeah,
It's messy. And, I've had many long conversations with my wife about that topic of like, what do I owe people in my
yeah,
private life in these conversations?
yeah. I've gotten both, and I've felt both where I have had the response or the comments of, "Hey, Peter, you gotta keep your comments to a minimum and
Mm,
just be the unbiased journalist." And I was like, "Hey, I'm not a journalist. I'm
yeah.
not trained in this stuff. I'm just a person who happens to know how to podcast and cares about this stuff." Um, so there's been some response and some feedback on I need to keep my opinions at a minimum. So I've heard that a lot because I did come out pretty strong on my own opinions
Yeah.
on these things. And
Especially in those early, like that
yeah, in the
early
early ones,
episode.
I
It was
came on
like,
pretty strong, and I got a lot of feedback for that, and a lot of that too is like I I struggle with being kind of the third party and just letting the facts be known of themselves, but also like this affects me as just a person. That some of the stuff that I'm hearing, some of the stuff that we're doing. And as a Christian, it affects me because of
mm,
what's being said and what's being done in the name of God. And so, yeah, I'm gonna let my opinion know. And also, I've never once said that like this is going to be an unbiased show. Like we've been pretty clear about who we're going after and why we're going after them and from what perspective we're coming after them. Um, so there's been that, but I do struggle with um, putting me out there. There's like difference between my opinions and being too forward about myself because I've been um, attacked is the wrong word. There's a lot of people who want to figure out like my personal life and the church that I go to and the people that I'm connected with and where I work. I get emailed, called, texted at least once a week on what church and where they can press charges of sin against me, which those are always fun. So there's a because I'm in these circles, I try to keep a little bit of a distance and say, mostly for my protection, my wife's protection, for my work's protection, for my church's protection, because the church that I was at when we first started this did finally get found out and contacted. So I went the opposite direction. So I'm gonna be as anonymous and as background as possible, but I'm still gonna let my opinions out there. And so I get I get it from all sides. Where yeah, you need to talk more, let yourself be known. And I get that more from like the volunteer team is like, hey, you're the face of this. Like you need to like this needs to be Peter Bell and Sons of Patriarchy. And I was like, I'm just not that kind of person who wants Peter Bell and Sons of Patriarchy. I want Sons of Patriarchy and the stories to be known. While also like I have really strong opinions about these things, and I have let those be known on this series too.
Yeah.
And we will get a lot of feedback on that. People was like, "This is great," or some people were like, um, uh, why are you inputting yourself in this at all?" It's like you
Right.
said, it's kind of no matter where you fall in that spectrum, like you're gonna get comments, and it's I just like I don't know the right way of approaching some of these
Right.
discussions.
Yeah, well, and it's all taste too. Like, there's people who just inherently won't like me or won't like you because for whatever arbitrary reason, or the sound of our voice,
Yeah,
or whatever it is.
yeah. It's
And
funny you say
but
sound of our voice. My accent gets made fun of, and I can't pick out where my accent comes from. Somebody
oh,
said it's a unique blend of SoCal and Pacific Northwest, where I have no family from the Pacific Northwest, but
huh.
supposedly, which is it's the Sarah who's on our team is gonna make fun of me for saying this during this recording because my accent gets picked on a little bit, which is hilarious. And like I know it's there, but it's yeah. Some people don't like me literally for the sound of my voice, which is fun.
It's funny. I haven't picked up anything, so I don't know. But also, I'm from California, so maybe we have the same, maybe we have a
I
same
think
uniquely
so.
annoying voice.
I think so.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I get that all the time. Like, what's funny is I used to get criticized, and I still do by a lot of pastors for having an effeminate voice, and I just assumed that was always the case,
Huh.
and now like I'll tell some people like, I've got like more of an effeminate voice, and they're like, "What?" So
Yeah,
I
I
don't
don't
know.
do that at all too. Yeah.
Verdict's out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
yeah, but
people are will press the gas pedal before they say anything on that for me because I was known before this for another podcast and I'm big in the fitness industry and so they're a little more worried about saying effeminate voice or effeminate features because I can beat them up.
yeah, that's see, you need to be in the profile in the podcast artwork so they get that vibe.
That's
You're gonna lower your bad reviews. I'm so accent blind though. I worked just a side story. I worked for a guy who was British, like very British, like grew up in London or no, grew up in England and very strong accent, very thick accent. And I did two job interviews, got the job, worked there for 3 days, and then I went in his office and I said, "Can I ask you a question? Are you British?" And he's like, "Yeah, what gave it away?" But I just like totally I just thought he had a different voice. Like I didn't pick it up as anything. So I'm a little accent blinded, but none of this is relevant to anybody listening to this. So we can
Yeah. Yeah. For my like the last little thing I wanted to touch on.
yeah.
Um, for those who, when this comes on our platform, so obviously our listeners are gonna hear it. Um, what I guess what sets I almost said patriarchy boys. I was gonna
It's
put
the
them
spinoff.
I was gonna put them both together.
Maybe that's
What
the name of the episode. Yeah.
if like I know this is gonna be a weird thing. It's a weird thing for me to do, but like why should somebody listen to Preacher Boys if they're a solid listener to Sons of Patriarchy and they hear Eric Skwarczynski, right? Did I say that right?
Skwarczynski.
Skwarczynski.
Skwarczynski. Yeah, you got to drop the Zin
Skwarczynski.
in there.
Um, if they hear Eric from Preacher Boys and they're like, "Huh, interesting. Maybe I should listen to that." Why should somebody listen to Preacher Boys?
Over your show? I mean, I can give
Or
it. No, I'm
like,
just kidding.
hey, let's
I'm just
well,
kidding.
we'll
Uh,
say yeah. It's like, hey, I'm gonna
have
leave
you
Sons of
heard Peter's
Patriarchy.
voice? You need to come over and listen. No, I'm just kidding. Uh, please don't beat me up. No, I mean, honestly, I think my show is. uniquely for some people. Like if you're somebody who is fascinated by fundamentalist, abuse in fundamentalist religious environments, it's probably going to be of interest. But I will say it's not for everybody because I go pretty in the weeds on some of those things. And so a lot of my show can lean toward like an inside baseball approach to fundamentalism. So I think if you were raised in it, it'll probably feel very comfortable. If you're looking for a glossary of terms on every episode, I might not be the best place. I'm trying to include some more of that as the show grows, and I have people saying, you know, what does this mean? What does it mean when you call this person that? But I would say if you want to hear firsthand accounts from survivors who've experienced abuse in religious environments, it's a really great podcast to listen to. And I think it complements a lot of podcasts like your own that are giving you kind of like this kind of church history lesson tied into the impact. Whether you're listening to like a Leaving Eden podcast, which does a really great job talking about the independent fundamental Baptist world, while also explaining it to people who have no context for it. Like it's just one of many great shows, that I think really gives an inside look at stories that have not been talked about enough. And the one thing I've said a lot, I said in the beginning of the show a lot, and I've been trying to say it more. The goal of Preacher Boys really is to take the microphone from people who've had it for so long and put it firmly in the hands of survivors to
Yep.
share their stories. And so, if any of that sounds compelling, check out the show. If you don't, no hard feelings. There's a billion other shows like Sons of Patriarchy. Like I said, Leaving Eden is a fantastic show that is very adjacent to mine. There's lots of great shows to listen to, but if it if my voice doesn't annoy you too much, you don't think I talk too much, it's worth checking out.
Good. And the last little thing, and this is what we always end Sons of Patriarchy, at least our Thursday episodes when we're talking to survivors, because we ask them to talk directly to those who have been hurt by the church, who've been hurt
Hmm.
by leadership, who've been hurt by others, and then leadership has either covered it up or not cared enough about it. Because this is near and dear to us, just like you said. So if you can end by talking to those, because people who listen to this and people who listen to Preacher Boys are hurt.
Yeah.
So can you talk to those who are hurt by the church, who've been listening to this and wondering, like, is there any hope for me? How am I going to figure this stuff out? It's great listening to this, but like, I don't
Yeah.
know who to talk to. I don't know what to do. So if you can end by talking to those who listen to this, listen to yours, listen to mine, or anybody else's who are hurting.
Yeah. I mean, the number one thing, and it's not the most encouraging piece of information, but I think it's important, is that you aren't alone. And I think that sounds pithy and cliche, and everybody says it. It's probably on the posters of crisis centers all over the country, like you're not alone. And I think someone said it better. My friend Kathy Durbin, who is featured in the documentary Let Us Pray, um, she said something to the effect of, being a survivor is like being a part of an amazing club that you wouldn't give up for anything, but nobody wants to be able to join it. And I think that perspective is really powerful. And I think what I would encourage the person who feels like they are sitting in a congregation of 100 people in a pew and they feel completely alone with their experience, not only has that experience probably happened to other people in that congregation, but there are people who have left and who have found a community that does care for them, that will protect them, that will encourage them, and will help them heal, and have built incredible lives that they never thought possible being in a strict, authoritarian, heavily complementarian place where they have no voice. And so I just want to say, like, don't feel completely alone and find that community that can support you. And I think, honestly, like, you know, when it comes to like my podcast, the best piece of feedback that I get when an episode goes out is every time a conversation goes out, I usually get emails or messages from people saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one,"
Yep.
or "Me too." And it's bittersweet to get those messages because it's sad that there is another person that's been through it. But it's amazing how many people have connected over similar stories. So, it can sound scary to leave everything and to leave the only environment and community that you know. But there is something out there, and there are others who will relate and will help you walk through that.
Yeah. Well, awesome, Eric. Thanks for accepting this invite and for doing a
Yeah.
little Sons of Patriarchy and Preacher Boys collaboration.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Patriarchy Boys episode 1 just is in the
That's
can.
that's right.